Before they became saints with stained glass windows and feast days, they were mostly just regular people. And by regular, I don't mean average in the motivational poster sense. I mean they were the kind of people you might pass on the street and forget 5 seconds later. Fishermen with calloused hands and sunburned foreheads. A tax collector who, if we're honest, was probably the most organized one in the group, and also the least liked. Zealot who, if he lived today, might be the guy who yells during town hall meetings, and a few others we honestly know very little about. Just names passed down in a list. It's important to begin here, because before we trace their travels to distant lands and mysterious martyrdoms, we have to understand where they came from. Not geographically, though many were from the fishing village of Bethsaida or the trade town of Capernaum, but socially, emotionally, even spiritually. These were not trained rabbis or elite scholars. They didn't sit in marble lecture halls debating abstract theology. Most of them barely made it out of Galilean schooling, which usually stopped around the age of 12. Their world was dirty, hard, loud, and deeply religious. When Jesus called them, he didn't issue job descriptions. He didn't offer salaries or relocation packages. He just said, "Follow me." And inexplicably, they did. Some left their boats mid-catch. One walked away from a Roman tax booth. They didn't even ask where they were going. It wasn't because they were brave, it was because something about this man disrupted whatever plan they thought they had. He wasn't like the other teachers. He touched lepers. He talked to women in public. He didn't seem to care about keeping powerful people comfortable. And so this ragtag group followed him, through fields and cities, into hostile synagogues and impromptu hillside sermons. They watched him heal the blind, calm storms, and argue circles around experts. But they also watched him sleep in boats, weep at funerals, and ask for help carrying his own cross. It was confusing, beautiful, disruptive, and eventually very dangerous. When he was crucified, most of them ran. One betrayed him. One denied him 3 times. Only John stuck around to see it through. But when he rose again, everything changed. They didn't become perfect overnight, but they became convinced. Not just that he was alive, but that he was worth living and dying for. And that's where their real journey begins. You see, the book of Acts tells us what happened right after, but not in full detail. History takes over where Scripture grows quiet. These men, once anonymous, would carry the message of Jesus to every corner of the known world, to India, to Africa, to Rome, and beyond. But before all that, they were just 12 ordinary men who said yes. Not because they had the answers, but because they couldn't unsee what they had seen. A man who loved them, called them, and changed everything. And somehow, even 2,000 years later, we're still telling their story, quietly, gently, and tonight, perhaps, just before you fall asleep. There's a moment in the book of Acts that feels like the hinge of history. Jesus gathers his disciples one last time, this odd little group of now 11 men who still don't fully understand what's happening, and tells them something outrageous. "You will be my witnesses," he says, "in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And then, without much fanfare, he ascends into the cloud. No travel vouchers, no game plan, just go. And they did. Now, to us, the ends of the earth might sound poetic, but to a first-century fisherman who had maybe travelled a few dozen miles in either direction, it might as well have been the moon. Most of them didn't speak more than 2 or 3 languages. They didn't carry passports or wear boots. There were no church buildings waiting for them. Just strange cities, strange gods, strange accents, and the occasional riot. And yet, within 1 generation, the gospel had been preached across the Roman Empire and even beyond it. Not by kings or scholars, but by the same group of men who once argued about who was the greatest while Jesus was explaining his own death. Something had changed. Or rather, someone had changed them. The Holy Spirit arrived at Pentecost like a divine windstorm, rushing, loud, impossible to ignore. Flames danced above their heads, and languages they didn't know spilled from their mouths. This wasn't just spectacle, it was empowerment. It was a reversal of Babel, a multilingual announcement that this message was no longer regional, it was global. But here's what the book of Acts doesn't give us: a detailed travel itinerary for each apostle. Some vanish from the biblical narrative after just a few chapters. That's where tradition and history begin whispering the rest of the story, sometimes faintly, sometimes with dramatic flair. And while we must handle those whispers with care, separating probable paths from poetic legends, they give us something Scripture doesn't: the scent of sandal dust on foreign roads, the quiet courage of men who were never meant to be famous and somehow became eternal. Tradition tells us that Thomas went east to India, that Andrew headed north to regions around the Black Sea, that Mark journeyed to Egypt, that James made it all the way to Spain. Some travelled alone, others, like Peter and Paul, ended up in Rome, at the very heart of the empire. These weren't vacation tours. They were often walking into hostility, exile, or execution. And yet, what's remarkable is that most of these men didn't write grand theological works. They didn't leave behind ivory towers or lengthy memoirs. What they left behind was legacy. Communities, conversions, and sometimes churches carved from caves or built in secret. Their sermons echoed through whispers and house churches, not microphones. In the centuries that followed, believers would piece together their pats, some from writings, some from oral tradition, some from the bones of martyrs hidden beneath altars. But in this section we pause not just to map where they went, but to marvel that they went at all. From fishermen on the Sea of Galilee to voices in far-off lands, the apostles became bridges between heaven and earth, not because they were eloquent, but because they were willing. And that, more than any passport stamp, is what truly carried the gospel to the ends of the earth. If the apostles were a band, Thomas might be the introvert in the back, the one who doesn't say much in interviews, but ends up writing the most emotional lyrics. He's most famous, of course, for doubting. It's practically his brand now, Doubting Thomas, like that one nickname someone gave you in middle school and you never managed to shake. But really, Thomas didn't doubt more than the others, he just said it out loud. And maybe that honesty is what made him so brave. Tradition tells us that Thomas went east, far east, not just to the next village or neighbouring province, but all the way to India. That journey alone would have been immense. We're talking camel caravans across Persia, ships hugging the southern coastline of Arabia, winding inland through tropical ports and spice-laden markets. A man who once refused to believe without touching nail-scarred hands suddenly found himself preaching in lands that didn't know the name Jesus at all. Historical traditions, particularly from the Syrian Christian communities in India, say Thomas arrived on the Malabar coast, modern-day Kerala, around 52 AD. not exactly prime missionary territory. He would have encountered ancient Hindu traditions, bustling trade towns, and linguistic challenges that made even Greek feel familiar by comparison. But according to the ancient Acts of Thomas, which blends history with a generous helping of legend, Thomas did what apostles do. He preached, he baptized, and he built, not just communities, but reportedly even a palace, though that part of the story may involve him accidentally becoming an architect for a local king. Long story short, Thomas was given money to build a palace, gave it all away to the poor, and when questioned said, "Don't worry, I built you a palace in heaven." The king was understandably not thrilled at first. Still, the evidence of Thomas's mission in India isn't just legend. Some of the oldest Christian communities in the world, the Mar Thoma Church, still trace their origins to him. They claim an unbroken line of faith that has survived invasions, colonialism, and modernity. Their very existence is a soft-spoken testimony that the gospel didn't just go west to Rome, it also went east in sandals. Sadly, like many apostles, Thomas's journey ended in martyrdom. The details vary. One version says he was speared to death while praying in a cave near Chennai, others place his death elsewhere. But what remains consistent is this: he died far from home, preaching a gospel he once wasn't sure he believed. There's a kind of quiet poetry in that. The doubter became the traveller, the skeptic became the pioneer. And perhaps, in a way, Thomas still speaks to those of us who sometimes struggle to believe, who want to touch, to see, to understand. His journey reminds us that faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's slow, questioning, and yet somehow ends up halfway across the world, planting seeds in soil no one thought would receive them. So, if you find yourself awake tonight, wondering if doubt disqualifies you, remember Thomas. He didn't walk away from his questions, he followed them, one step at a time, all the way to the edge of the known world. If you asked most people what Mark did, they'd probably say he wrote a gospel, and then maybe go blank. He's not usually grouped with the original 12. He's not the loudest voice in Acts. He wasn't Paul or Peter or one of the big-name martyrs. But Mark, quiet, often in the background, was one of the first to bring Christianity to Africa. And for a background guy, that's kind of a big deal. Mark, also called John Mark, first shows up in the book of Acts as a companion on Paul and Barnabas's missionary journey, and it didn't go so well. Somewhere along the way he left. We're not sure why. Maybe the road was too hard. Maybe he got homesick. Maybe he just realized being an apostle's assistant wasn't as glamorous as it sounded. Whatever the reason, Paul was not pleased. Later, when Barnabas wanted to bring Mark along again, Paul basically said, "Hard part," the two even split up over it. But that wasn't the end of Mark's story. Far from it. Mark eventually made his way back into ministry, and into the heart of one of the most influential cities of the ancient world, Alexandria, Egypt. A bustling, multicultural port on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria was a hub of learning, trade, and religious diversity. It had a massive Jewish population, a famous library, which sadly burned down, and enough philosophical schools to make even Plato feel overwhelmed. It's here, according to early church historians like Eusebius, that Mark preached the gospel and founded what would become the Coptic Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions still alive today. Think about that. While Christianity was just beginning to take root in Europe, it was already growing roots in African soil, watered by the words of a man who once walked away from ministry. The Coptic tradition holds that Mark was not only the first bishop of Alexandria, but also a martyr. He was dragged through the streets, literally by ropes, for publicly proclaiming his faith, a brutal end, but also, in the quiet way martyrdom often is, a powerful beginning. His blood, they say, seeded a church that would endure for centuries, through conquest, persecution, and cultural upheaval. To this day, if you walk through Cairo or visit a Coptic monastery in the Egyptian desert, you'll find icons of Mark, sometimes holding a scroll, sometimes with a lion beside him, the symbol of his gospel, a reminder that even the quieter apostles left roaring legacies. And here's something gentle to think about. The gospel Mark wrote, the one many scholars believe was shaped heavily by Peter's preaching, is the shortest and most action-packed of the four. No long genealogies, no nativity scene, just a sprinting account of Jesus' ministry, full of urgency and movement. It reads like someone who didn't want to waste time, someone who had learned, perhaps, that second chances shouldn't be squandered. So if you've ever failed, walked away, or felt like the side character in someone else's story, take a moment to sit with Mark. His life reminds us that your place in God's story isn't decided by where you began, but by where grace leads you next. If apostles were assigned by volume, Bartholomew would be shelved near the whisper. We don't hear much from him in the Gospels, just his name quietly listed among the 12, no dramatic outbursts, no walking on water, no thunderous sermons recorded, and yet his absence from the spotlight may be what makes him so compelling. Some believe Bartholomew is the same person as Nathanael, the man Philip brings to Jesus in the Gospel of John. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nathanael asks, skeptical and unimpressed, until he meets Jesus face to face. What follows is one of the gentlest rebukes in Scripture, as Jesus says, essentially, I saw you under the fig tree. No lightning, just a moment of quiet knowledge, and suddenly Nathanael believed. After Pentecost, Bartholomew fades from the main narrative, but not from the mission. According to early tradition, he travelled east, possibly with Philip or Thomas, and preached in Mesopotamia, Persia, and eventually Armenia. That last one is especially significant. Bartholomew is considered one of the first to bring the gospel to that region, laying foundations for what would become the world's first officially Christian nation. His ministry wasn't grand in size, but steady in spirit. Stories suggest he healed the sick, cast out demons, and translated the Gospel of Matthew for local communities. Long before the printing press or even reliable mail routes. In some versions of his story, he's invited to a royal court to speak. In others, he works quietly among villages, far from palaces or power. But like so many of his fellow apostles, Bartholomew's faith eventually met a brutal end. Most traditions agree that he was martyred in Armenia, and not in a gentle way. Some say he was flayed alive, his skin removed as punishment for preaching Christ. It's a grim, difficult detail, but also a testament to the cost of conviction. He didn't raise armies, he didn't argue in courts, he simply kept speaking of Jesus until someone made him stop. And yet, he's remembered. Not just in stained glass or statue, but in faith that survived the centuries. Passed from family to family, church to church, heart to heart. In Armenia today, Bartholomew is still honored, and, in the quiet spaces of Christian memory, his whisper remains. He reminds us that not all ministry is loud, and not every legacy is carved in headlines. Sometimes it's carved in mountains. Sometimes in the memory of a region that once listened to a quiet man speak about a risen king. So if you've ever felt unnoticed, unseen, like your efforts are small and your voice doesn't echo far, remember Bartholomew, remember that God sees beneath the fig trees, and that heaven keeps score very differently than the world does. Andrew often gets introduced as Peter's brother, which, if you think about it, is a little unfair. He was the first disciple Jesus called. He was the one who actually brought Peter to Jesus, and yet history often treats him like the guy holding the camera in someone else's graduation photo. But Andrew, like so many of the apostles, quietly did something extraordinary. He went where almost no one else wanted to go: north. Tradition tells us that Andrew took the gospel to regions around the Black Sea, places like Scythia, Thrace, and what we'd now call modern-day Ukraine, Georgia, Romania, and southern Russia. In other words, cold. Not the warm, sandy settings we usually imagine when we think of biblical lands. These were rugged frontiers with harsh climates, wild geography, and tribal peoples who didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for foreign preachers. The early historian Eusebius mentions Andrew travelling to Scythia, which in the Roman imagination was kind of like saying way out there. To them it was the edge of the map, the land of barbarians and snow and people who drank fermented mare's milk. Yes, that was a thing. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't prestigious. But Andrew went anyway. And he didn't go with a caravan of support or a scroll of credentials. He went with a message and, most likely, a lot of prayer. According to various traditions, he preached along the Black Sea coast, endured harsh winters, and slowly gathered communities of believers in places that had never heard the name Jesus. Some legends say he even journeyed as far inland as what's now Kiev, and that he blessed the hills there, saying a great city would one day rise in the name of Christ. Now, whether or not that specific moment happened, one thing is certain: Eastern Christianity owes a deep debt to Andrew. To this day, he's considered the patron saint of Ukraine, Russia, Romania, and Scotland. Quite the resume for someone who started off as a Galilean fisherman. His legacy is especially cherished in the Eastern Orthodox Church, where he's seen as the founder of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, the spiritual leader of Eastern Christianity, which means that while Peter became the symbolic head of the West, Andrew quietly became a father to the East. And, like many apostles, Andrew's journey ended not in retirement but in martyrdom. He was reportedly crucified in Patras, Greece, on an X-shaped cross, now known as St. Andrew's Cross. It's said that he asked to be crucified on a different type of cross than Jesus out of humility. Whether that part is historically certain or not, the image has endured. A man stretched between two beams, not bitter, but faithful to the very end. So next time you see the X on the flag of Scotland, or walk past a church bearing Andrew's name, remember this: he was more than Peter's brother, he was the first called, and one of the farthest travelled, a quiet witness in cold places, bringing warmth wherever he went. James, son of Zebedee, also called James the Greater, was part of Jesus' inner circle. Alongside his brother John and Peter, he witnessed things others didn't: the raising of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration and Jesus' agony in Gethsemane. He was there for the highs and the heartbreaks, the dazzling light and the shadows, and of all the apostles, James was the first to die for it. His martyrdom is one of the few we find clearly recorded in the Bible. In Acts 12 it says Herod Agrippa had James killed by the sword, an act meant to win political favour. No trial, no farewell letter, just a sharp, brutal ending. And that's where the biblical account leaves him. but not where the story ends. Because while James may have died in Jerusalem, his story stretches far west, to Spain of all places. According to tradition, before his martyrdom, James travelled to the Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal. It's not exactly a short trip. From Judea to Spain meant weeks on the Mediterranean by boat, or, if you're adventurous, an overland trek through Roman roads, mountainous terrain, and an entirely different cultural world. But the idea that James made it to Spain, preached the gospel, and planted seeds of faith has persisted for over 1,000 years. Now, historians debate whether James truly travelled that far. There's no concrete archaeological proof of his ministry in Spain, but what we do have is something perhaps just as enduring: pilgrimage. You see, in the 9th century, a tomb was discovered in northwest Spain, in the region of Galicia, that was believed to be the resting place of James. A small shrine grew into a cathedral, and the city that rose around it became known as Santiago de Compostela, literally St. James of the sight by a strange celestial light. Whether fact or folklore, the result was one of the most sacred destinations in Christian Europe, and thus began the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James. For over 1,000 years, pilgrims have walked its trails, some hundreds of miles long, wearing wide-brimmed hats and carrying scallop shells, the symbol of James. They walk to find clarity, healing, forgiveness, or maybe just silence. Along the way they pass through ancient villages, Roman bridges, and weathered chapels. Their feet follow the same paths trodden by generations before them, all pointing west toward the sea, and the bones of an apostle who, if the stories are true, once walked there himself. Whether James preached sermons on Spanish soil or his relics arrived later through faithful hands, one thing is undeniable: his life-inspired movement. He was a fisherman called to follow, and he kept following, even after death. His journey became not just a mission but a metaphor, one that invites others to walk, not perfectly, not quickly, but faithfully. So if you ever find yourself weary, looking for direction, or just needing to move through your questions, picture James, not just standing still with a sword at his side, but walking, always walking, toward the edge of the known world, leaving footprints for others to find. If early Christianity had a power duo, it was Peter and Paul. They didn't start as friends. In fact, they didn't even start in the same spiritual neighborhood. Peter was a Galilean fisherman, uneducated, impulsive, warm-hearted, but often confused. Paul, by contrast, was a trained Pharisee from Tarsus, sharp, articulate, and once so zealous he tried to stomp the church out before it began. And yet somehow they both ended up in Rome preaching the same gospel, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, but always pointing to Christ. Peter was the original insider, chosen by Jesus, given the nickname Rock, the one who walked on water for half a second. He helped lead the early Jerusalem church and wrestled publicly with the challenge of Gentiles joining the faith. Paul was the outsider turned insider, converted on the road to Damascus, then launched like a firework into the Gentile world. He travelled extensively, planted churches obsessively, and wrote letters that eventually became the backbone of the New Testament. Their stories overlap a few times in the book of Acts, and famously in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he recalls confronting Peter to his face. Apparently, Peter had been eating with Gentiles but pulled back when certain Jewish Christians showed up, Paul was not impressed. "I opposed him to his face," he wrote. That probably made for an awkward dinner party. But eventually both men made their way to Rome, the capital of the empire and the symbolic center of the Gentile world. Whether they arrived together or at different times, the result was the same. The gospel reached the seat of Caesar, and it did not go unnoticed. Tradition holds that Peter was crucified upside down during the reign of Nero around 64 AD. He reportedly requested this because he didn't feel worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. His tomb lies beneath what is now St. Peter's Basilica, a building so grand you'd almost forget it sits atop a martyr's bones. Paul, meanwhile, was likely beheaded, a quicker, more dignified execution often reserved for Roman citizens. His execution may have taken place just outside the city, on the road leading to the port of Ostia. A small chapel marks the spot today, and while his head may have been silenced, his words still thunder from pulpits and pages alike. It's fitting, really. One man preached with his hands, the other with his pen. One fed lambs, the other built theological scaffolding. Together they anchored the gospel in the east and west, and in death they became twin pillars of the early church. Martyrs not of status, but of surrender. If you ever feel like you're too flawed for purpose, too inconsistent, too combative, too complicated, remember Peter and Paul. They were bold and broken, passionate and prickly, and somehow God used them both, not because they were perfect, but because they kept showing up, kept walking, kept writing, kept feeding and challenging and believing. And in the end they gave everything: words, wounds, breath, for a kingdom that promised no crowns here, but something eternal just beyond the sword. By the time the others had faded, some by fire, some by sword, John was still standing, still writing, still remembering. Excellent, Beatrice, does the art of... He was the youngest of the 12 when Jesus first called him, a son of Zebedee, nicknamed along with his brother James the Sons of Thunder. Not exactly a title that suggests bedtime serenity, but thunder, if you've listened long enough, always gives way to quiet, and John, somehow, became the last echo of a generation that had walked with God himself. Unlike his brother James, who died early, John avoided martyrdom, not for lack of effort, according to tradition. Some early sources suggest he was arrested during the reign of Emperor Domitian and even thrown into a vat of boiling oil. The result? Nothing. No burns, no screams, just a confused executioner and a very intact apostle. Whether that story is history or legend, the message it carries is clear. John's mission wasn't finished yet. He was exiled to the small rocky island of Patmos off the coast of modern-day Turkey. It was a kind of ancient solitary confinement used to silence agitators and dreamers. And it was there, on that barren rock surrounded by sea, that John received what would become the book of Revelation. A vision not just of judgment and fire, but of hope and restoration, of a lamb on a throne, fears being wiped out of, all things made new. But even before Revelation, John had already left us something just as powerful: his gospel. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John didn't focus on the timelines or parables. He wrote with poetry, with memory, with the kind of insight that comes not from hearing a story once, but from living inside it for decades. "In the beginning was the Word," he wrote. "Not a manger or a census, but eternity breaking through." His gospel is full of long conversations, personal glances, lingering moments. It reads like someone who not only saw Jesus with his eyes, but loved him with every part of his being. In his letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he sounds like an old man who's stopped trying to impress anyone. He repeats himself a lot. He talks about love more than logic. He calls his readers little children, not in a condescending way, but in a grandfatherly, pastoral tone that makes you want to listen slower. "Love one another," he says, over and over, as if that was the only thing worth remembering when all is said and done. Eventually, John left Patmos and returned to Ephesus, where he lived out his final days. The early church fathers say he had to be carried into gatherings too old to walk. When asked to preach, he would say the same thing every time: "Little children, love one another." When someone asked why he never changed the message, he reportedly said, "Because it is the Lord's command, and if only that is done, it is enough." He was the last witness, the final voice from the original circle of 12, and instead of using that position to exalt himself, he chose love, chose patience, chose to write words that would outlive him by millennia. So if you're feeling left behind, or wondering why you're still here while others have gone, think of John. Not forgotten, not overlooked, just called to remain, and in that remaining to speak softly of love, and to see visions of a world restored. If the early church had a front porch, James the Less was the one sitting on it, quiet, steady, and always watching the door. He doesn't get the same spotlight as Peter or Paul, and he certainly didn't travel as far as Thomas or Andrew, but while the others scattered across continents, James stayed. In fact, he stayed right at the heart of it all, in Jerusalem, the birthplace of the movement, and the city where the gospel first took its first public breath. And that made him more than just an apostle. He became something like the first pastor. Now, there's a bit of name confusion to clear up. There were several Jameses running around in the New Testament. This James is often called the Less, or the Younger, possibly because he was younger in age, or simply less prominent in the public eye than James the Greater, the son of Zebedee. Some traditions identify him as the son of Alphaeus. Others link him as a close relative of Jesus, even calling him Jesus' brother or cousin. Welcome to early church genealogy. Half history, half holy guessing. What we do know is that James the Less became the leader of the Jerusalem church, a role that carried enormous weight. Jerusalem wasn't just a holy city, it was a political powder keg. Tensions ran high between Jews and Romans, between Pharisees and Sadducees, and now between followers of the Way and nearly everyone else. And yet James held it all together. While others debated theology or dodged stones, James was the one writing letters that sounded more like wisdom literature than war cries. In fact, the Epistle of James in the New Testament is widely attributed to him. It's not a flashy letter, no dragons, no shipwrecks, no visions of heaven. Just down-to-earth guidance, watch your tongue, care for the poor, live what you believe. You can almost hear him sigh through the scroll, the way a patient leader does when the community starts bickering about who gets the better seat. Tradition says James was so devout, so committed to prayer, that his knees were calloused like a camel's, hence the nickname, Old Camel Knees. Not the most glamorous title, but somehow perfect. While others built churches with words and wanderings, James built one on his knees. But faith, even when quiet, has its cost. According to early historians like Eusebius and Hegesippus, James was eventually brought to the top of the temple in Jerusalem and told to publicly deny Jesus. Instead, he began preaching. So they threw him off. And when the fall didn't kill him, they beat him with clubs until it did. Not exactly how you'd expect the quiet one to go out, but James wasn't less in legacy. He was the hinge between the old and the new, the rooted Jewish heritage and the blossoming Christian faith. While others went wide, James went deep. And maybe that's the point. Not every calling leads outward, some lead downward, into prayer, into patience, into long-suffering love for the people right in front of you. James never planted churches in faraway lands, but he pastored the one in the city that changed the world. If the early church had a travel department, Philip might have been the one quietly handling the logistics, sending messages, bridging cultures, and building spiritual roads where there weren't even physical ones yet. Now, to be clear, we're talking about Philip the Apostle, not Philip the Evangelist, who shows up later in Acts. Different guy, similar job title. But this Philip was one of the 12, called by Jesus in Bethsaida, a quiet town up near the Sea of Galilee, where fishing nets were more common than scrolls, and most of life smelled faintly of salt and olive oil. Philip is one of the first to follow Jesus, and his early conversations in the Gospels hint at a personality both inquisitive and deeply relational. He is the one who told Nathanael to come and see when Jesus was first gathering disciples. Later, during one of Jesus' sermons, it's Philip who does the math and says feeding 5,000 people just isn't in the budget. Practical, grounded. Someone trying to make the impossible make sense. After the resurrection and Pentecost, Philip disappears from the main narrative, but tradition fills in the gaps. Ancient writers like Polycrates of Ephesus and Eusebius trace Philip's steps to Asia Minor, particularly to a city called Hierapolis in Phrygia, modern-day Turkey. This wasn't just some backwater. It was a Greco-Roman cultural hub, known for its hot springs, pagan temples, and philosophical chatter. Not exactly the most receptive place for a traveling preacher with a story about a crucified carpenter. But Philip wasn't aiming for comfort. He preached boldly, sometimes alongside his daughters, who were known as prophets in their own right. In fact, early records often mention Philip's 4 daughters as some of the first female voices in Christian history, lending spiritual authority in a time when women weren't typically given a mic. One of Philip's most legendary acts in Hierapolis involved confronting a serpent cult, a group that worshipped snakes and healing deities. As the story goes, Philip cast out a serpent, healed the sick, and turned a public confrontation into a revival meeting. Whether that's exact or embellished, it paints a picture of someone willing to step into spiritual chaos without flinching. But like most apostles, Philip's faith eventually cost him. Tradition says he was martyred in Hierapolis. Some say crucified upside down, others suggest he was stoned after publicly denouncing the local deities. Either way, his tomb became a sacred site. In fact, archaeologists believe they've uncovered it in modern-day Turkey, a quiet resting place beneath layers of ruins and reverence. What makes Philip stand out isn't just where he went, it's how he went. Not as a celebrity preacher, not with grandeur or armies, just one man, faithful in places where faith wasn't fashionable, a practical disciple with a deep well of courage, bringing the message of Christ to a world that thought it had heard everything. And maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes God uses the practical ones, the spreadsheet minds, the detail-oriented planners, the quietly bold, to turn a city upside down. If the 12 apostles were a choir, Jude, sometimes called Thaddeus, was the voice you had to lean in to hear, not because he wasn't singing, but because history just didn't bother turning up his mic. In the Gospels, he's often listed as Judas, son of James, or Thaddeus, possibly a nickname to distinguish him from the other Judas. You know, the one with the more infamous ending. Church tradition seems to prefer Thaddeus, which means heart or courageous, depending on who you ask. Either way, he was clearly someone you'd want on your side. Jude shows up in only one recorded moment in Scripture, a quiet question in John 14 after Jesus says he will reveal himself to those who love him. Jude asks, gently and curiously, Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? It's not a flashy question, no fire, no fury, just a humble curiosity from someone trying to understand the shape of grace. But once Pentecost came, the silence breaks open into legacy. Church tradition tells us that Jude eventually traveled east, preaching the gospel in places like Syria, Mesopotamia, and even Armenia. He's often paired with Simon the Zealot, and the two are sometimes portrayed as a missionary team, one with the fire of a revolutionary, the other with the heart of a shepherd. Some sources say Jude brought healing to Edessa, an ancient city in modern-day southeastern Turkey. The king there, according to early legends, had written a letter to Jesus asking for healing. Though Jesus didn't go himself, the story goes that he sent Jude later to heal the king and preach to the city. Whether historical or devotional, the tale shows how early Christians saw Jude as a bringer of hope and restoration. He is also traditionally credited as the author of the Epistle of Jude, a short but punchy letter near the end of the New Testament. It's just 25 verses long, but it doesn't waste a word. In it, Jude warns against corrupt teachers and urges believers to fight for their faith, not with swords, but with truth, humility, and mercy. The letter closes with one of the most quoted benedictions in Christian history. To him who is able to keep you from falling. Words written by a man who, for most of his life, went unnoticed, but who clearly noticed everything around him. Jude's death, like many of the apostles, comes in a cloud of tradition. Some say he was clubbed to death. Others claim he was crucified alongside Simon. Both stories end in blood and silence. But Jude is still remembered, not in popular sermons or gold-leafed icons, but in the quiet way his name made its way into the hearts of many. For even today he's known as the patron saint of lost causes, not because he lost, but because he kept showing up when everyone else thought hope was gone. When all seemed impossible, Jude was the one who kept believing it wasn't over. And maybe that's why he matters. In a faith full of loud moments, Jude is a gentle reminder that the soft voices, the forgotten names, the late verses, they still matter. God doesn't forget those the world overlooks, and sometimes the quietest disciple is the one who speaks loudest when the world needs it most. If you had to cast the apostles as a group of misfits thrown together for a divine mission, Simon the Zealot would be the wild card, the one who showed up with fire in his eyes, a dagger under his robe, figuratively we hope, and a long memory of oppression. The title Zealot isn't just decorative flair, It points to a very real, very radical movement that existed in first-century Judea. The Zealots were known for their militant resistance to Roman rule. They weren't big on compromise, diplomacy, or waiting around for justice. If there was a Roman coin in circulation, they probably hated it. If there was a Roman soldier nearby, they probably glared at him. So when Simon, a man from that ideological tribe, joined Jesus, the one preaching turn the other cheek, it was a bit of a spiritual plot twist. And maybe that's what makes him fascinating. Jesus didn't just call fishermen. He called a former tax collector, Matthew, and a former radical rebel, Simon. One used to collect money from the people, the other probably dreamed about overthrowing guys like Matthew, and yet they followed the same Saviour, ate at the same tables, and eventually preached the same gospel. That's not just grace, that's a miracle. After the gospel, Simon fades into the historical shadows. There is no clear record of him speaking or writing, but early church traditions offer a handful of possible paths. Some say he travelled south to Egypt, others believe he went east to Persia, and still others claim he reached as far as North Africa. Like an apostolic passport stamped in obscurity. Simon's journey is one of the least documented, but strangely one of the most widely speculated. In some traditions, Simon is paired with Jude, Thaddeus, travelling and preaching side by side. Together they are believed to have confronted pagan cults, healed the sick, and challenged local rulers. Their end, most accounts agree, it was violent. Simon was either sawn in half, crucified, or beaten to death. The details blur, as early sources mix reverence with hearsay. But the legacy remains. Simon died preaching the message of peace he once could never have imagined. And here's the quiet wonder. The man who once may have dreamed of liberation through force found his purpose in a gospel of surrender. The man who once fought for a kingdom of Israel died for a kingdom not made by human hand. We rarely hear sermons about Simon the Zealot. He's not the apostle with a letter or a miracle or a famous quote. But maybe that's exactly why he matters. In the background of every movement are the ones who simply stayed faithful, who let go of what they were for what they could become. Simon reminds us that transformation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, off-screen, unrecorded. A former revolutionary who found a new kind of revolution, one built not on swords but on sandals and sermons. He vanished from the pages, but not from the story. He wasn't there when the sea was calmed. He didn't walk on water. He wasn't at the Last Supper. And yet he was chosen to stand with the 12. Matthias is something of an apostle, added not during Jesus' ministry, but after his ascension. The disciples were left one man short after Judas Iscariot's betrayal and death, and they felt the vacancy deeply. It wasn't just a numbers issue, it was symbolic. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles. A foundation needed all its stones. Though in Acts chapter 1, after days of prayer and discernment, the early believers gathered and nominated 2 men, Joseph, called Barsabbas, and Matthias. Both had been with them since the beginning, walking quietly in the background of miracles, teachings, and heartbreak. In the end, they cast lots, a traditional Jewish method of seeking divine will, and the lot fell to Matthias, and just like that, he became Apostle 12. And then, silence. No sermons, no letters, no miracles recorded in Acts. Matthias, newly chosen, disappears from the biblical spotlight as quickly as he entered it. But tradition picks up where Scripture leaves off. Some early sources suggest Matthias preached in Judea. Others claim he ventured north to Cappadocia or as far east as the Caspian Sea. There are even whispers of his mission reaching Ethiopia, although those may refer to another apostolic figure. As for his death, accounts vary. Some say he was stoned in Jerusalem, others that he was beheaded in Georgia, not the US one. A few even claim he died peacefully, making him one of the very few apostles to go quietly. No matter the ending, Matthias's story isn't built on dramatic moments. It's built on faithfulness in the background. He reminds us that being chosen doesn't always come with a spotlight, that divine appointments aren't always followed by public applause. Matthias was faithful long before anyone noticed, and he stayed faithful long after the attention moved on. And maybe, for a closing act, that's just right, because the story of the apostles isn't about fame or platform, it's about obedience. Some went to Rome, some went to India, some vanished into dusty trade routes and oral tradition, but all of them said yes. Some with fire, some with fear, some, like Matthias, with a quiet nod. 12 stones, one foundation, and the last one chosen still held the weight. And so, one by one, the apostles faded from the world's stage, some quietly, some violently, most without statues or fanfare, no bookdales, no pensions, just footprints in the dust of foreign roads, and stories whispered by those they left behind. They were not born into power, they didn't hold office, they weren't particularly brilliant or strategic. Most couldn't write Greek fluently, but they carried something heavier than scrolls or swords. They carried the message that God had walked among us. And somehow they didn't drop it. Some walked north into the cold mist of Europe. Some sailed east into the unknown waters of India. Some bled in arenas. Some roped by candlelight. Some died early. Others lived long enough to remember too much, but not one of them turned back. And the church they helped build? It didn't look like much at first, just scattered communities of slaves, farmers, widows, and children. No buildings, no budgets. Just bread, wine, prayer, and the memory of Jesus. But over time, their words took root in every corner of the empire and far beyond it. Today their names are etched into stained glass and carved into cathedrals, but their true legacy is quieter. It's in every whispered prayer, every worn Bible, every person who's ever looked at their life and asked, "Could God really use someone like me?" Because the apostles were never meant to be untouchable saints. They were meant to be examples of obedience, of surrender, of how far grace can carry someone who says yes. So as this story slows and your eyes grow heavy, remember this. The apostles weren't perfect, but they were faithful. They didn't understand everything, but they followed anyway, and the world was never the same. Their roads were long, their endings often lonely, but their message endures. And now, as you drift towards sleep, know that your story is part of theirs. That same spirit still moves, that same call still echoes, and somewhere in the quiet, the gospel still walks. So, wherever you are tonight, whether you're drifting to sleep or just letting your mind wander through the past, may the stories of these ordinary men remind you, faith doesn't need fame to leave a mark. It just needs footsteps. Thanks for listening to Mildly Interesting Theology for Sleep. Until next time, rest well and walk gently.